So,
questions? John?
I was interested in the, well, I've jotted down a couple of questions. They're all somewhat interrelated. I guess one of the first ones I want to ask is, when you were doing the studies of response to risks associated with nuclear waste, what was the study population? Was this in Sweden?
yes, all of this work is in Sweden.
Was it a culturally diverse population? Were there, for instance, members of like a lap society or?
No, well, actually, most of the work on nuclear waste has been concerned with two so-called candidate municipalities, two small communities where it's being considered to place the final decision will be made soon about where the repository will be, and national data. For example, the nanotechnology data are national data.
From Sweden?
Yeah, from Sweden, right. So when it comes to cultural diversity, Sweden used to be a very homogeneous society, but we now have about 15% immigrants in Sweden. And those people tend not to respond to our questionnaires at all to the same extent as others, for obvious reasons like language and so on.
Sure.
So,
Well, the reason I was asking was I was interested in the what you have called the epistemic trust, and picking up on some of Rich Stoffel's work on Yucca Mountain here in the American Southwest, and Native American responses to perceptions of risk and trustworthiness and so on. And what you're saying fits very well with some of his findings, but he even steps back a bit further and talks not so much of risk perception as risk conception. And that is how it is, how risks are framed and understood almost from an ontological standpoint. And so when you talk about interfering with nature, here we often hear people saying, playing God.
yeah.
And the difference being in animistic societies, you could talk about playing gods, or where you have things like inanimate objects like rocks, for instance, and radioactivity is a measure of the angry rock. And there's been, I don't know if you're familiar with the article that he's written on confronting the angry rock, which is really kind of the basis for Native community response. And so I was wondering if you could comment on this idea of risk conception and how that would play into epistemic risk and perhaps ontological risk as well.
Well, I'm not sure I have so much to say about it. I think I did a study in Africa, I haven't published it, but I did a study in Africa some 10 years ago. And I find there with very poor people living there that they have some, about the same ideas as we have about technological risk. Also in Brazil, by the way, I find the same thing. But they also have other notions about risk that we don't have usually, having to do with religious animistic ideas. We don't have them. So it seems they share same risk notions to a large extent with us, but also have some other risk notions.
Maybe I'll follow up on that. I'm also intrigued by this epistemic trust question, and my own experience in the Southwest is just what you've said, that that certainly the Indians complaining about Yucca Mountain and waste there run through the whole technological thing that everybody else does. But there are then additional concerns about rocks and water and so on. But what I was thinking about was about 15 years ago, I was on a panel sponsored by the American Physical Society, which had the rather pretentious title, see if I can remember it, Public Perceptions of nuclear power and the crisis of confidence in science, okay, which, as I now think about it, is a group of scientists who were thinking that the fact that the public didn't love their technology meant that they believed that that they weren't believing in the whole physics of it. At the time, I argued against this position, and I still, it's hard for me to change my mind very quickly. It's hard for me to change my mind. But I argued that a lot of this discrepancy was based on failures of communication at a fundamental level, that physicists just constructed their view of nuclear power differently from the way the public was. And I was thinking, as you were saying this, that there may be some differences in America. The community groups I talk to aren't quite as polite about the nuclear experts they talk to, though what they often feel is that they can't think right because of their science, and that they hide behind the science so as not to face unpleasant truths or something. And those attitudes seem to me somewhere in between epistemic and social trust.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I think it's related to the concept of antagonism. I find some 15 to 20% of our respondents do subscribe to antagonistic idea. They think that, that the industry is out there to get them, so to speak, that they have a hostile or negativistic relationship to technology or industry or whatever. So those people do exist, of course, and those opinions are there. But in Sweden, they're not dominating. The Swedish society, it's a very trusting society, actually. The social trust is on a high level. We did a study where we compared Western European nations, Sweden, Norway, similar. But then if you go to France and the UK or Spain, you see that people are much less trusting of the institutions and of the experts. So the social trust differs, but the epistemic trust problem is still there also in Sweden. Yeah.
I'm curious about how the notion of epistemic trust actually plays out in the public forum, particularly in cases where it's difficult to isolate a single institution that is the focus of attention. For example, we're just in the process of opening our Nano Center at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. When public pronouncements are made to the surrounding community, what you often have is advocates talking about the great prospects of economic benefits, etc. Often these, and it's not necessarily that there is a single person representing a single institution, such as we have a member of the General Assembly as a politician representing that institution, a scientific researcher representing the institution of science, etc. So I'm curious how we separate out which institution actually is, or should we even separate the single institution that is garnering trust from the public. What about cases when you have a confluence of these institutional representations? I mean, perhaps we could say that people are having reactions if they have very adverse risk perceptions regarding a new nano center, that they are actually having an adverse reaction to the capitalist mindset, that because clearly it's being made very explicit with the promise of